Before, after, before, after.
They turned out to be completely unreliable assholes.
Hello, Tim.
Hello, Ryan.
And hello, everyone. Welcome to episode 126 of Dismembering Horror, the podcast, where myself, Ryan McDuffie, and
myself, Tim Aslin.
That's right. We dismember a horror film for you. To dismember a horror film for you means we talk about what worked, what did not work, and anything that we found interesting or noteworthy about you heard right, you guessed right, horror film. And today, for episode 126, we watched from 1958, the original The Blob. Directed by Irvin S. Yeaworth Jr., produced by Jack H. Harris, written by K. Linaker and Theodore Simonson, with a story by Irving H. Milgate. There you go, Tim.
Thanks. I really appreciate it. I bet they all do too.
Absolutely. I appreciate it too. Yeah, we got an Irvin and an Irving amongst that group. Great, Tim.
Yeah.
Tim, anything else you got before we wade right into the glooby blooby blob that the blob is?
No. I mean, my dad loves this movie, but I kind of want to have him sit down and watch it again and see how much he still loves it.
It'd be fun to get his 2 cents on it for sure. Someone who's closer to when it was released than we certainly are.
I'm pretty sure he was born in 49. He probably saw this in the theater as a kid. And that's why he thinks it's so awesome.
Can you imagine seeing this as a 9-year-old? And I got into a lot of the behind the scenes special features and stuff with this one. And it was really one of the first, if not the first, color sci-fi horror films.
Yeah.
So people were especially flipping out at this blob, this big red blob.
Yeah, it's pretty funny.
And to think your dad was amongst them, that's pretty fun.
Yeah, somewhere in, oh God, I don't know, where would he have been? In Wisconsin.
Great. Which for me just all blends together as I just picture it like this town from the Blob.
Yeah, pretty much.
Great. Well, we do have a trailer for this film, so should we watch that and keep it going?
Sure.
All right. Here we go. As I said, from 1958, here's the trailer for The Blob.
Dave! Doc Hallen's been killed.
Doc Hallen, what happened?
It's over at his place. You gotta come now.
Oh, wait a minute, Steve. Tell us what happened.
Well, I'm trying to tell you. Now, this thing had killed the doc.
Well, what was it?
Stop with it, kid. But it's kind of like a mass that keeps getting bigger and bigger.
Every one of you watching this screen, look out. Because soon, very soon, the most horrifying monster menace ever conceived will be oozing into this theater.
Of course, right up front, they just had to let us know they indeed are teenagers. I liked that because I was confused. I was definitely confused.
Easy to be confused.
Yeah.
Jesus.
Kind of one of the many ways. It's classic, though.
Yeah.
Though there were definitely critics at the time who called it out for it, which is funny. And I know Steve McQueen was self-conscious about that. And anyways, we're getting ahead of ourselves here, or I am at least, Tim. Tim.
Yeah.
Tim.
Hello. Yes.
So for The Blob, should we proceed with our rating system? Would we tell ourselves to avoid it, stream it, rent it, or buy it?
I don't think it's very good. I think I would say stream it. It just didn't. Yeah. It's a bummer because it's, I don't know, considered classic in some respect or all respects or whatever, but it's just not good. The good parts don't outweigh the 90% rest of the movie that is just a blah. It's not a blob, it's a blah.
Despite all that, would you still be down to go to Blob Fest and see the film someday at the theater it was shot at?
Sure.
Okay.
That sounds fun. That sounds way more interesting than the movie.
Great. I was all sorts of places in how I wanted to rate this, Tim. While watching it, I was feeling what you said. You're already what? You don't know what I'm gonna say. He has his face in his hands. I mean, honestly, I was just like so frustrated with the whole cops not believing the teenager thing.
God.
It was just so frustrating in that way, But I feel like just watching this and going through the special features and everything, it just made me like fall in love with the premise like all over again.
I love the premise, don't get me wrong.
And that in the end, it does deliver on that premise. And now that I haven't seen it in forever, and I'm reminded that it is like largely based on just the teens not being able to convince the parents thing, I think that won't annoy me again.
Yeah.
And it also just got me excited for the stuff all over again, which I gave a rent. So honestly, after the 2 days sleeping on this and absorbing all the stories behind it and stuff, not only would I want to put the stuff now to a buy it for me, I also would put the Blob to a buy it.
Oh, wow.
And so I guess for some more context too, like the 1950s, I guess that's all. The 1950s, I love, like just things that were made then, the way it's captured, whether at the time or from future people looking back at it. Like I just love it so much. And this feels kind of like like I said at the beginning, it's rare to have that in color where it's like a sci-fi horror movie from the 50s. Mm-hmm. You have Steve McQueen, I think, was totally fun and interesting and kind of weird in a way that I don't know, that I really enjoyed. Yeah, exactly. Committed. Much like Carnival of Souls, I just like love the kind of fun story of how it was produced and put together in a more independent spirit. So, and then like the special effects, how they did those at the time, and like how that was this whole other like half-year production after the production that they got themselves into, and how innovative it was. And then just when you think there's no other movie where you get those shots of them running out of the theater like that are quite like this. Like this is the quintessential that. So yeah, even the initial viewing was kind of mixed. I wasn't sure if I wanted to give it a rent it or buy it. I was suddenly going to rent it. I've now settled to, yeah, man, I want the Blob. I want the stuff. I want more Blob. This is great. I can't say the word enough. Blob, 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 blob.
Yeah. Well, I mean, you're entitled to your opinion.
And so are you, Tim. You're entitled to your opinion.
Yeah.
But you'll see, I didn't have tons of what works. So it really is like...
It's a vibe.
Yeah, exactly. Dude, but
I'm with it.
I'll save it for now. I've already said enough. I'll get into what worked once we get into what worked. But should we get into the simple setup of what our story here was?
Sure.
For our summary, yeah.
Yeah, you got Steve and Jane.
Right. Steve McQueen is Steve.
Yep. Always a funny reality when you see a young new sort of star getting a bigger break. And I feel like this is just a thing. I don't know why they think they need to do this, if it's like a version of coddling the actor to make them they think it'll just make them feel more comfortable if they name the character their own name. Like, whatever. Anyway, so they do that. And so they're on a date. They're at Lover's Lane kind of shit. And they see a shooting star. It's really a meteor. And they're like, oh, I'm going to check it out, meteor. Oh. And so it sparks Steve's interest really more than anything to go check it out. And on their way to check it out, they run into an old man who lived in the area of where the meteor landed. And he had gotten curious.
That guy
pokes it with a stick. And it cracks open. And there's a little blob inside of it. And then he, like a dumbass, like lets it, blob down the stick and then grab his hand and starts eating.
It blobs up the stick.
Well, that's right. Blobs up the stick. And starts basically eating his hand, So he flips out. He runs into the street, runs into Steve and Jane. They pick him up, take him to the doctor at night.
So good. His scream, who he is. He's like such the quintessential like kook outside of town.
He's this old dude with messed up hair and patches on his jeans. It's great. Like iron-on patches, which I think is even funnier. So then we're off to the races, right? The big thrust of the movie is that the doctor obviously buys in because he's looking at the damn thing growing on the old man's hand. And it, continues to devour and spread. So the doctor's like, this is serious. We should amputate this guy's arm off. And meanwhile, Steve and Jane have gone to they've been asked to go check out the old man's place to see like what's up. And so they take their teenager friends, their 30-year-old teenager friends, out into the woods, and they run around. They find pieces of the meteor. What else? I don't know. They come back. They fight with the cops because they're like, hey. Oh, so they go back to the doctor, and Steve sees the doctor getting attacked and devoured by the blob. In the interim, the doctor and his nurse had the blob had totally devoured the old man, and then turns on the doctor and the nurse and goes after them. So
and
then
Steve, he's suitably horrified.
Oh,
and that's the real thrust of our story here. Is he is shocked. He is beyond shocked, as he should be.
Yeah, and like he keeps kind of saying like, this is crazy, and what I just saw, I get is crazy, but I saw it, and we need to do something about it. And like all the adults, all of the cops, well, except one, are pretty much like, you're just pulling our leg. You're just a kid. You're just a teenager. You're just up to no good. And it goes on and on with that nonsense. So
that's actually that's one cop versus there's that cop who has a vendetta against teens because of something that happened to his wife or something, like killed in an accident or something like that. Then you have like the main sheriff guy who's kind of like, well, hold on, we don't know they did anything, the reasonable one. Right. And then there's the sort of more quiet chess playing one who doesn't seem to really take sides. It's just kind of whatever.
Yeah. And then you've got their parents who are kind of two sides of a coin of like, Jane's dad is all worked up, and Steve's dad seems very kind of, what would you call that? He's sort of like quiet and reserved and not like Steve at all.
He's kind of conservative in the classic sense of like, he's a good boy. He's done nothing to lie. You should believe him. And then Jane's dad is the school principal too.
Right. And then I don't know, man. It sort of meanders. Like, to me, it just sort of meanders. The highlights are that, it's late. It's after midnight in this town. We know that there's a bunch of people at the midnight showing of a horror film something at the theater. And Steve and Jane sneak out to continue to investigate what the hell is going on. The Blob gets a couple people, like nobody really knows that the Blob is getting people or that it even exists. So it gets a mechanic, and it shows up in the grocery store. It gets the grocery store like janitor guy. And then Steve and Jane go into the grocery store, and it almost gets them, but a key moment, they go into the walk-in cooler, and the Blob tries to get in and then goes away. And then this is a play-by-play.
Yeah,
What
we don't.
else?
This is just a short summary, man. We just and then they all team up.
A Blob from outer space comes to town, a small town, and devours townspeople until a teenager and his girlfriend can alert the town and warn them that the Blob is there.
Until they can, convince the skeptical adults to, they basically until they see it for themselves, and then
That's
they
right.
all
So
work.
they never were convinced.
Then they all work together in the end to to stop the menace, the red menace. Wait, that's something else.
Well,
you're right. Yeah, metaphor bounds. Right. Great. All right. Well, let's get into our first section then. What worked?
What worked for you? What worked for you? What worked for you?
It worked like a charm.
What worked for you?
I mean, Tim, the opening credits were like, I wanted to give it a buy it just for those opening credits. I loved them so much, from the song to the animation, just that combination. I've been on
I love that stuff too, but did you feel like it was appropriate for this movie?
It's true. Yeah, there was original score that I think the director was kind of sad was, the studio replaced or whatever. But yeah, I think like it can still, it allows us to sort of, it allowed me at least, like, rather than saying, oh, this is totally like tongue in cheek and whatever, like it might kind of suggest the music, and which if you haven't heard it, it's kind of like has kind of like a tequila start to it, and it has
it's like beach blanket bingo-y.
It's Burt Bacharach is one of his first writing credits, and it
Not
sounds very
surprised.
much like something he'd do. But it's weird. It had like a doubling over effect for me, where like, because I felt like I could go into this more fun, kitschier way, then it allowed me to actually get on board with it in the serious way too, versus if I had the sort of classic upfront beginning of like, this should only be taken, seriously and terrifying. Like, I love that too, but I don't know. And again, maybe it was just so of the time that that something of being like so of the time just brought me to that time and brought me to being that audience. And like, it was still great and still classic, that song. I loved it.
Yeah, I mean, I don't disagree. It's sort of, I think the theme for me throughout this movie is that there are individual elements or moments that stand alone, and I like as singular things. So, that doesn't necessarily it doesn't always add up to a great movie. But like that song and the animation in particular, I don't know. It's not nostalgia because it's not our era, but I love that stuff. Any of that stuff for some reason is just like, it's like the first, the original opening of the first Bond movie. It's just like, there's something, I don't know how to describe the feeling that it gives me. but it gives me a feeling. I don't know. It's
For me, it's the feeling is you are allowed to have fun. And it's allows. It's kind of like I said, that doubling over effect of like, because you don't have to take this seriously, you can take it seriously. It's weird. I don't know.
Yeah. Yeah, I don't know. I dig it. I'm with you on that one.
Well, even though it sounded like you said that it kind of meandered or whatever, I really loved the pacing of it, actually, where it seemed like it was just that classic, just monster on the loose. It kills people throughout. The people are, on the tail trying to stop it or whatever. And it keeps killing, the occasional person until the big showdown. Like, it just is the classic that,
Yeah.
And just something I noticed, the kills, I felt like they came at just exactly the right time. And I don't know, I liked everything in between too. Like, they were just kind of, whether it was the weirdo, like, little brother and just like that scene with him on the staircase, we're just going like, what? Whether it's kind of like this whole back and forth between his, like, I kind of hate the word, but like frenemies is kind of what they are. Like, they're drag racing each other, but then they have to convince each other. It just sort of set up this whole fun little world. Just that it was all in the small town, that it was kind of like, I love the thing where it's like it just started as an innocent date they were on, but then just turns into this adventure over a single night. So I like watched it, from that perspective of like, they're just, movie starts with them necking in Lover's Lane. And then it's like, then here's the rest of their evening where it led. Like, I liked, I don't know, that's fun as a jumping off point to me. And just meeting, and then as frustrated as I was with the cops, I think the fact that you had the one that was like, that they weren't all like, oh, darn kids, but that was all wrapped up in one cop, that it felt like it was more about that in a way,
Right.
Or it acknowledged it in a way a lot of these movies don't.
Yeah, and there is this sort of clearly overarching, I don't know if it's a message or a theme, or it's at least an attempt to sort of point at a thing of like adults in general being dismissive of teenagers and like what the implication of that may be. Because like, I think in particular it stands out when when Steve recruits all of the teenagers from the movie theater. They go out and he's like, look, we got to warn everybody. And that's cool. And then they all split up and start going door to door. And two of them, I don't remember which one. I think it's Tony and his girlfriend, but maybe it's not. They they go up to a house, like a fairly like big house, knock on the door, and there's a clearly an adults party happening where they're like they're having a cocktail party or soiree or whatever, and the host who answers the door is this sort of like, I don't know, how would you describe him? He's austere in a way, I guess, but he's totally smashed. And like does not listen to a word they're saying. Like completely disregards what they're saying. Is just like, yeah, man, let's have fun. Bleh. And like that thing, and they do the same thing kind of with the bartender. Another couple or teenagers go into the bar and like they're like, hey, you gotta be whatever, watch out. And he's like, yeah, the only monsters I see are drunks. And it's like, dude, like, listen to what they're saying. Like, why would they even go in there in the first place, right? So there's this overarching thing of people just being like, you're dumb. And like, I like that. I think it only sort of scratches the surface in this movie, but I like where it's going with it.
But it's like, for the time though, seeing what it was like, it may feel, I guess from our modern perspective, it's scratching the surface. But this was a whole push in another direction of movies that weren't like doing this at all, where teenagers were just miscreants. So it's like everything they did to,
So, only 3 years earlier, Rebel Without a Cause was sort of the quintessential version of this story.
Yeah.
Where it is only about a teenager who feels, what it's like to be a teenager and have the world around him just not make sense. And like they do what the Blob is trying to do in a very dramatic way.
Yeah.
And in every single scene. So like I appreciate that, and I kind of get what they're going at.
I like though that it was acknowledged in this movie though. Like I really like the moment, I guess it was towards the middle, I forget exactly, when Steve's kind of ready to give up and throw his hands up in the air. And Jane's encouraging him. And he's like, well, what are we supposed to do then? What am I going to do? And she's like, well, you just keep trying. If you saw this, and I don't know, I really like that moment. And where you say maybe it didn't get as in-depth as you like, I thought it just felt like it just seemed on par for it's over a single night. There's a very just clear goal of just trying to convince them, and that's there, and it didn't need to get more complicated than that.
Sure, yeah.
Well, were you saying any of that to? I guess you didn't agree it was well paced, but I mean, did you have something in there that was a clear what worked in what you were saying?
I mean, I think I don't know. I think I said it sort of. Just the attempt worked. The attempt at leaning in on that, but I don't know.
I liked I mentioned Jane being the one to tell him basically what to do. Of course, it's like she's not nearly as much as I'd like her to be, as a lot of the women co-leads or whatever. Having as much to do as I'd like, but I did really appreciate the moments and see that it definitely was pushing more than I'm sure a lot of other movies. Where I loved, of course, that moment where she basically is the only one who knows what to do when he's clueless, the dude's clueless. Mm-hmm. And then, of course, when she makes that great quip making fun of the cop was so good.
Oh, yeah.
You remember where he's like, they're just trying to make us look silly here with this blob or this prank or whatever. And she goes, I think you're doing plenty a good job of that yourself or whatever.
What a burn.
Yeah, it was so good. Like, oh, burn. Exactly.
I really like when she sees the Blob in the grocery store for the first time, and she falls into a can tower, like one of those displays of cans. She falls into that thing so hard. It's like, it's really convincing, man. She goes down like a ton of bricks into this tower. And then Steve, he like catapults himself up over the shelves of the aisle. It's the whole sequence. That actually might be my favorite sequence, is the grocery store sequence. Mm-hmm. I think that one has the most sort of like, oh no, look out, you're in trouble. There it is. Got to get away. Now we're screwed because we're trapped. Oh no, we're not trapped. Like it has that nice kind of reversal sequencing. So that one I think probably stands out the most.
I love how they got led there too, where the dog was the one hot on the Blob's trail, which was a fun way to kind of like justify the dog being there, aside from it just being cute.
Yeah. Old man, whatever his name was, his dog.
Oh, right.
Old man, that's his name.
Yeah, actually,
in the credits.
His name's Olin Howlin as Old Man. Wow,
what a name,
Olin Howlin. I mean, not much more to say about it. I already said it kind of before what worked, but just the fact that it is in the 50s and was made then is so great. And I mean, you could say this about any movie from the 50s, which is why it's weird, but it just feels especially applicable for this one to say, like, the way it's not just about 1958 people, but feels like it's how 1958 people saw themselves.
Sure.
Like, just something about that. Like, it's that extra layer of putting you in a place and just sort of the mindset of a time versus, my other favorites. Happy Days and American Graffiti just made much, way after the fact as nostalgia films. But it's cool. It felt like a nostalgia film from the time it was made. Just this extra layer of putting you there. I really, really loved that about it. And go ahead.
It does make me. It makes me curious. I mean, kind of like anything in this sort of time capsule way, to be like what was the world like right then? Like what was sort of going on in the world and in the minds of the people making this movie, even just from a kind of a collective consciousness way. 'Cause like 58 wasn't the Korean War right around then? I think that was like 55-ish or something like that. What impact did sort of the events of the world have on this? And is there the sort of an underlying, maybe theme or maybe just like motif that consciously or not consciously is happening? This idea of the thing, this sort of amorphous otherworldly thing that devours you.
Yeah.
Like it always intrigues me the idea of what the deeper sort of layers of that could be, intentional or not. But at the end of the day, I think part of why this general concept works so well is because it's just vague enough in that sense that you can insert a lot of your own personal. It could be, it holds up universally because it is this just amorphous idea in actual blob form, right? And I think that thing that might be the most compelling thing about the concept and why it actually kind of keeps coming up, over the years, right? Like there's been a remake and there's sort of, versions of this in different forms.
Monster Blood is a Goosebumps one I love.
Yeah. So there's something about that I really love. And I mean, granted, limitations of the time and production and whatever. The biggest thing about this movie that I think works is the whole idea of wanting more of it. Like, every time the Blob shows up, I'm like super excited.
Yeah. Me too.
So I don't know. There's something cool about that from maybe a thematic or philosophic point of view that also works really, really well for me, on top of the fact that just visually it's so cool.
So yes. Yeah. And it can just come down to that. It's visually so cool. And then here we are, trying to ask why is that exactly? But so sort of two thoughts on, you mentioned the premise and what it says, or what did people at the time make of it, or why it, came out then. I mean, yeah, it's kind of, you're essentially saying this, but it's just that the premise is so, it's a high premise. It's a clear premise. It's high concept.
Yeah.
And those really are the best. Like just possibly, likely, mindless, we don't know, devouring machine. It represents, I guess for me, I don't know, you look at it as a force of nature, basically, unstoppable force of nature, which is great, which is sort of tied to in the ending when Steve, they say, oh, it'll be frozen forever in the Arctic. And then he goes, unless the Arctic melts, just this idea of like nature is always unpredictable. It can't be reliable. So,
yeah.
So just this, that it's straight up such a high concept, I think has a lot to do with its classic status and why it's revisited in different forms. But then as far as, why at the time and what did people making at the time, why is, what works they are in with that? For me, it's kind of like the joy of when we learned that tidbit about Fiend Without a Face, another 50s movie we watched. One we both loved. But remember, they had that promotional stunt where they had like the Fiend out front of a New York theater, and it was just like bedlam. Like people were going crazy for it, and it would like move around, and people like drove from everywhere to go see it and stuff.
My God!
Similarly, just to like the idea of the Blob in itself and people just getting on board with monster movies, like politics aside, time aside, it was people are confused as ever, blah, 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 blah. But to see people just having fun and like pure joy with just a monster movie premise and that connecting to these people from that time in this way, and it's old enough now that like, you're old if you were a kid in this movie kind of thing. It's a further and further lost time ago. As how the past works. But there's something so satisfying about seeing these past people just having as much as a ball as present people would with just something that's as simple and non-complicated as, because it's horror, it's sci-fi, it's ridiculous. It's just great in that sense. And like I can tie that too when the classic scene in this is when they're all running out of the movie theater away from the Blob. It's coming through the little windows and the projection booth in the back. But it's what's so great about it wherever you look, when we look at the people running out, like I'd say a quarter of them are like laughing or smiling. They're just having a ball. And it's just great because it's like they're having so much fun they just can't help themselves, and they're just like real people, cast as extras in the small town or whatever. And then you have the other 3/4 of them are like doing their darndest to just scream and look terrified, and it kind of reminded me of something like 2000 Maniacs, when you just have the locals playing extras, and there's just something so special about seeing like all these people who are non-actors, but like this is their moment to like react as if there's a monster, chasing after them. And it's just, there's just something so special and fun about that. Even if it's not, an Oscar-worthy performance, it's their version of doing it and going for it. And it's just so special and fun to me. I love it.
Yeah. The more I think about the setting and that sort of small town USA thing that exists in this, and little details, the more I sort of am leaning that there was kind of an attempt to say something in this movie, a broader attempt. So the first thing that sticks out to me, and look, maybe I'm reaching for stuff, but whatever, I'm going to go with it because I think it's cool. The theater itself is called the Colonial Theater. I don't think that's just random. The Colonial Theater. The place that they end up getting trapped and almost dying in at the end is a very quintessential diner. Right? Like that is every sort of Norman Rockwell diner, middle America, I don't know what else to call it. It's sort of a symbol of Americanism of the 40s and 50s. And then this idea of this lead dude, I think the biggest thing that stands out about Steve's character that is very clearly purposeful is that for the first at least half of the movie, he says in response to people like questioning where he's coming from, like the things that he's seen and like what's going on and all of that, he says, "I don't know," constantly. I mean, he says it like 10 times as a response.
Right, like when they're like, well, then what happened to the body?
Yeah, and he's like, "I don't know." That's such an unusual thing for a lead man, They're really moving away from the traditional ideas of what a lead is. And I think that there's something in that, all those things, that there's almost sort of this attempt to kind of be like, and what the Blob does. The Blob devours this Everytown USA town. it devours the symbol of 50s, 40s, 50s USA in the diner. It takes over the movie theater, right? It like explodes the colonial movie theater. So it almost feels like there's sort of this theme of like the old guard, the old way of looking at things, or the things that we've stood on as Americans and hold up as symbols of Americanism, get devoured. And the only person who could stop it is somebody who can actually admit that they don't have all the answers. And that's okay, that's, it's still noble for him to be the lead person and not know. So there does feel like there's this sort of deeper thing going on, and like he figures it out. So even if you weren't gonna like peel back that onion and just take it at face value, he spends most of the movie not knowing until he knows the answer, and then it saves the day. So that's cool. But I like this idea of those things being connected and actually being sort of a broader, maybe thematic thing that's going on.
Yeah, I agree. It's all there, and I think now that you pointed it out is largely something I loved about it. I don't think it. I see it more as being just a part of the fabric of it versus something intentional.
Yeah, I kind of feel that may be true too.
Which is that doesn't hurt or help it. I honestly, if anything, I think it helps it because it was about the time made at the time. It's just one of those things by the virtue of it shooting it and setting it in a small town in rural America, 1957 when they made it. It's just, it's great. It's all there. It's all there. And the fact that he, doesn't have all the answers, that works really well for the payoff. Like, we're as frustrating as it is, just having it all rest on the adults not believing the kids or not being sure to believe the kids, whatever, that it makes the ending that much more gratifying when they do all finally work together. Like,
exactly. I mean, I think that really is, if you're going to take just one thing away, it's like when everybody, when everybody is sort of, what's the word? When divisiveness is happening and everybody's looking at everybody else through a sort of individual lens, you're never going to get anything done.
Yeah.
And when you fucking work together and actually like listen to each other.
Right. And I love it, especially something about when that's a cross-generational thing where it's like you have the quote-unquote establishment, all the people who are run the world, so to speak, actually connect with the truth, quote-unquote, that the kids bring. It really, like, it made the ending, it was so satisfying because of that. It really did feel like just, when it caught up in the movie way, like, this is the feeling as if our government and Congress got on board with fighting, all the things with fighting global warming, let's say, is applicable here, nature, doing the right thing with nature. It felt like that kind of joyous, if that were to happen kind of thing, where it's like, and then just seeing them fight the battle together, the joint cause, where all the teenagers working together with all the other townsfolk and the police and the firefighters to defeat the Blob. It's so good.
Yeah, so even just from that, like on that level, it's really satisfying.
Yeah.
I mean, granted, for me, it felt like an eternity to get there, but whatever.
Yeah.
So I think the big other thing that stood out to me that I both think is amazing and also just sort of amusing, I guess, at the same time. The way that they shoot the Blob often is, they do a combination of different styles of effects with this, right? So there's the kind of blue screen, it would have been, I guess, version, which is just sort of they projected a blobby thing onto the film, right? Like they took pictures of the blobby thing just being a blob. Most of the just it being round stuff is that. Sometimes you get it moving or whatever, and I'd be curious to, like, did you watch stuff on how that was done? Did they have stuff on it?
They never mentioned anything like that, and I don't even think blue screen existed at the time.
It did.
Okay. They didn't mention any effects. Like the ones that they mentioned were, of course, the reverse speed stuff, and then, reverse, like how it goes up the stick,
Right,
or
right.
like through vents and stuff like that,
Yep.
and then just miniatures, basically.
So
and
that's
then
the one
drawings.
that I love the most. So there's there are a handful of shots of the blob. Like we've established a location. So they do it with the diner. I think they do it with the grocery store. And they definitely do it with the theater, where they've taken just a picture from the film, right? Like they've taken a frame from the film and they've printed it out onto paper, and then they've put the paper, like glued the paper onto cardboard, and then cut out features like the seats of the diner are cut out and placed so that there's a 3-dimensional aspect to it. And then they cut like the doorway. They make an actual slit in the cardboard so that they can shove the blob jelly, whatever, through it in essentially a close up. It's actually pretty amazing for what it is, because it takes about 2 seconds for your brain to actually register that what you're looking at is not actually the space that they're existing in. Right, that it is these cardboard cutouts, but it's just super cool.
Yeah,
like I love it so much. It totally sells everything about the blob moment.
Of course. And I mean, as they said, kind of like a lot of great, like Star Wars or whatever, the effects took so long because they were inventing them as they went along.
Right, yeah. Yeah, I love that stuff. Like there's a moment when the blob sort of like stretches out and is like poking at stuff. It's so cool. I honestly don't know how they did it, but I wish there's got to be a documentary somewhere that like goes into it. But
there's there's the 2 commentaries. I made it through one with the producer, and I don't know who he was, but I'm just going to call him a blob scholar. And then the second one was with the director and the actor, one of the actors, one of the dudes, and I wasn't able to finish that one. But there's a whole, I watched it, was great. Maybe this is more things of note, but whatever. There's a documentary. Remember, I recommended the website Cinemasker, that YouTube channel that James Ralph does, and he has this stuff on a bunch of horror movies. He did a little video. It's cool. It's like a full 20-minute little visit video on that town and Blob Fest. I think it was 2008 Blob Fest, 2009, something like that. And anyway, one of the characters he meets, to roundabout answer your question, is someone who's the owner of the blob itself, like the surviving blob of the blob. And he sort of took the mantle of writing a whole book on the behind the scenes and the making of the blob. So even if there's an actual documentary about all those special effects things for you, there is a book. That's a thorough making of.
Nice.
Yeah.
Well,
but I agree. What worked, special effects, just great classic. Even when it is the like this just so hokey stuff at the end where it's like these clearly just these cartoons of like the electrical wire falling onto the blob and everything. It's still just great. I love it.
Yeah, it still is okay. I mean, it's just fun. So who cares at that point?
It's still it's handmade, man-made. It's great. I mean, and yeah, I don't need to get specific, but basically just all the little set pieces in between the big opening and the big finish, I just did crack me up and I enjoyed, and largely just because of the actors, just I don't that they were 50s people set in the 50s. Loved it. That little kid though, like what was his deal, Tim?
Oh man, I don't know.
Is that just how kids are? Like
no. Definitely not.
Okay.
That's how that kid is. Although, I'm pretty sure I had those pajamas that he's wearing.
Funny. Maybe
Yeah.
your dad, when he remembers seeing the Blob as a kid and wanted to dress his kid as a little
right?
50s kid.
Hopefully he didn't want me to act like that kid. My God.
No. So weird. Anyway, it sounds like that's it you have. I mean, it's kind of all I have. The ending was great. Kill it by putting it in the Arctic. It was fun.
All the cars.
Oh yeah, I loved that when they get all the cars honking to get the town to show up. Oh, what's going on here? Blah 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 blah. It's great.
Yep. Cool.
And I guess this last thing on, I mean, I was just curious, like when you said Steve McQueen is acting a certain way or is doing a certain thing with his character, how would you define what that is and like what worked for you about his performance?
Oh man, he's an interesting dude. I think that Steve McQueen's one of those people who, because like part of what catapulted him is just that he could literally just stand and exist and do nothing, and we would find him compelling. And some people are just like that, right? His acting in this, I would say, is not great if you look at all of the acting he did as he, throughout his career. Like this is, he feels green to me in this one more than any other thing I've seen. Like he feels like he's trying to act like James Dean, but do Steve McQueen's version of James Dean, which is an interesting and very strange thing at times. Like he does a couple things that Dean did in other movies, just mannerism things that I was like, oh, weird. But he had such a strange childhood and upbringing that I think that just is in him. Like he's just that kind of dude. And so in this, my only issue, because he's compelling, but my only issue is just that he's so clearly an older dude. And he's not that old. He's 27 or 28 or something like that when they filmed this. But because he's one of those guys who like had kind of a rough life, like rough childhood, it wears on him. Like he wears his experiences. So it's a double-edged sword because we're compelled by him because of those things and just who he is. But like trying to swallow that he's 17, no.
And that worked for you because
it works for me in that they just throw it out. They're like it's just Steve McQueen. Just let him do his thing.
Yeah,
which I actually really love. Like just the idea that somebody is so compelling that it doesn't matter, that it doesn't make sense.
And here, that's a good way for me to kind of connect back to what I started saying with what the opening titles and that theme song does. When I said it allows you to not take things seriously, therefore you can take it more seriously, or maybe just get into it more. Like Steve McQueen being not 17 is a perfect example of that. Like I let my sort of judgmental guard down or whatever because of that, and then can just get on board. Yeah,
he's an interesting dude. I actually would like to I've gone down a couple rabbit holes about his life, and it's very interesting.
Well, we have another section before Things of Note, but I'll have a bit more on him for Things of Note. So.
Oh, cool.
Great. But you're set for our next section then.
Oh, yeah.
All right, here we go. What did not work?
It's not ready yet.
Seems to work okay.
No, something important's missing.
What did not work?
It's not so much that we're trying to buy in that he's 17. What didn't work for me is that the movie is trying to remind us and hammer it home a little too much that he's 17. Like we didn't have to constantly be told, hey, remember, they're teenagers. There's crazy teenagers. You teenagers, stop doing things, teenagers. Even by like in the title having them listed as the teenagers, like in the opening titles, they are separated as the teenagers. Like Don't do that. I didn't need any of that. I would have bought in more and just accepted it if they had lightened up on that stuff.
Honestly, it's funny because this is you could say what didn't work, but is the opposite of coming from the opposite place of that, where like I actually wanted more just kind of quintessential what I think of 50s stuff. Like I wanted to see them maybe at their school or something like that. Like I don't know. I wouldn't have minded a little more of them being teenagers somehow. I mean, all that's there is great. So it's not a huge what didn't work, but I don't know. For some reason, I just wanted to see like them in school at some point. But whatever.
Yeah.
It's all over one night, so you couldn't really do that. Anyway.
Yeah, it would have been cool, I think, to get a little more of what you're saying, that like them living in their natural environment. Right? That I think that helps us get sold on who they are.
Yeah, that's the weird thing is, though, they did that as much as they could for it being all over the course of a night. So that's why it's just kind of like, okay, whatever. But I think that just speaks to, I don't know, I like their little world and I like the running time it is, but whatever.
Oh, yeah.
I don't know.
Yeah, I mean, my biggest complaint is that you just have these series of scenes in between Blob moments that I don't even like. They're hard to even describe because they're just so kind of nothing burgers of conversation. Like they're important in their essence, like what the scene gets across ultimately in most of them is totally part of the story, but they just hang on to the scenes for way too long for me. Like, for example, the first time we meet the doctor, right? He's closing up shop. He's like, all right, I'm heading out. See you next week, or whatever he says. That's all we needed to know. But then he like gets on the phone, has this long conversation that's just saying the same thing over and over. And it's just like, he's just standing there on the phone. It just seems like filler to me. Like they didn't really have a lot of actual script going on. So they just filled out scenes that they don't give us anything worthwhile. We got the information we needed. He's trying to go out of town. We need that information so that later when the cops are like, what happened here? They can go on the search for him, right? That's fine. But like everything else is just whatever. Like after the other weird thing that in the opening moments is the whole interaction between Steve and his frenemies, as you put it. When they run into each other at first, it really seems like they don't know each other. Like they're acting like, hey, you drove fast around us. Do you know who we are? You're the new king, so you need to like wear the crown. They do this whole thing, and it seems like, oh, he just crossed the like local hoods, and they don't know each other. They have no connection to each other. Like wrong side of the tracks kind of stuff. And then they do their little backwards drag race, which I thought was funny. And the cop, Steve has this conversation with the cop who he knows, and then he drives back up to the guys that he was racing, and they're all buddies. They're like, what happened? What was that about? And they're like, oh, yeah, that was Dave. Oh, yeah,
They're
Dave.
just waiting there so long during this conversation that Steve's having with the cop too. Like, what are they doing that whole time? It cracked me up.
It's so strange, and it just feels awkward and weird. And then they have this long, long conversation of everybody just standing outside of Steve's car. And you're like, so are they going to like get back into it and have some sort of conflict, or is it going to resolve somehow? No, they just move on. They're like, Steve's like, hey, I just remembered. I got to go do a thing. You guys want to come along? And they're like, no, we want to go to the movies. It's just like, what is happening? You know what I mean? Like, it's like they said, we don't really have a script, so can you guys just stand around the car and talk for the next 5 minutes? Because we got to fill out the scene. Yeah. It just doesn't feel like anything. And it bums me out because I want things to connect, to something, or like to make us feel something, some sense of urgency or whatever in this movie. Or like, why are you putting it off? There's stuff to be done. Like, I need something.
You can see how, for me, that connected within itself, and how it's a trade-off that it works for me in the end, where the good outweighs the bad as far as all that stuff. Just for me, smells of super independent film made outside the Hollywood system. And I think just the cumulative effect of like maybe, that trade-off is worth it for me, of like, yeah, you may have these scenes where it's like they go on a little long, but combined with it's just fun watching the actors do anything for me. And, in these settings, in the situation, it's almost pushes it in the realm of hangout movie in that little bit that I like. And then,
That's
and
interesting.
then it just adds it all to this really independent spirit that just sort of, I don't know, made all that click to me versus me wanting it to be something else. Like, because then everything else that was maybe the more obvious or clear, like good stuff to come out of what was the independent spirit side of it. Just, I don't know. It all worked for me.
Yeah, I think ultimately the problem I have with that style, I guess, especially in a movie that is about a singular threat, is I personally prefer a movie that has a straight line, right? Like, we know it. And this one sort of does, but I think it gets murky and is hurt by certain aspects. But when you establish the straight line, there's this thing that's going to potentially kill people. We have to figure it out. The fun to me is all of the like hiccups and hurdles and roadblocks and like things that sort of get in the way, like the zigzagging you do along the straight line. But when you have scenes that they're not even a zigzag, they're on another line, or they're not on a line at all. They're just it's just people existing. My willingness to get on board with that, there needs to be something else within the scene that is compelling enough for me to get on board with that. So an example of a director who does that really well is Tarantino, right? Like, he'll just have a scene that goes on and on and on, but he's able to sort of make the scene interesting enough and it's like the thing of when you hold the joke long enough, a bad joke becomes funny. This never accomplishes that. And so that to me is sort of the problem. It's like a really good writer could have made every single one of those scenes in this movie that feel kind of like, where are we going and what's going on, feel like something. But that just doesn't exist in this movie. So it's like you're saying, it's like you either get on board or not. But it's just missing for me, like my taste. It's just missing elements that get me on board.
Can you imagine a Tarantino Blob movie?
It would be the greatest thing ever.
Right? Yes, exactly.
You would probably see the Blob just as much as you do in this movie.
Yeah.
And every other scene would be amazing because it would be like us getting to... Here's the thing. Getting to know the townspeople is so important to me in this type of movie. And it almost gets us there, but doesn't quite. Like we start to like knock on the door of that and don't quite arrive. I want to know the mechanics. I want our characters to have interacted with them, establish them as people who exist in this world, even in the most minute way, before we then meet them again and see them or the one guy die. Like, I want to know something personal about these guys, not just him being like, oh, I'm going to get so drunk later. Like, I want to know, like, the secrets that everybody in the town has.
What's their idiosyncrasies? Yeah.
Right. And then when they're in danger, we care. Then I'm like, oh my God, there's something at stake here.
Yeah.
You know, and you can do that a lot of different ways, but you can do it in the primal sense that, like, oh no, they're going to get killed. But you can also do it in the heart sense, the sense of, like, the things, the secrets they have and the life they're living matters to them, you know, and that's having small town interactions and idiosyncrasies and seeing what the relationships to each other mean internally to them that's to me how you get in and get compelling small town. This is probably true for anything, but, like, in particular in this small town, like, setting, that's the kind of thing that I really want. So
some examples maybe, yeah, for what you're imagining, like as if the old man at the beginning, again, because he's credited as if that's his character name, like as if he had some sort of interaction with his little dog that we then later meet. You know, we actually get to see them together, which doesn't happen in the movie, I don't believe. That could have been a fun moment. Or let's say...
Yeah, so just off the top of my head, let's say that's a great example. Take the old man, right? All I need is 30 seconds of him calling for his dog and being like, where are you? You know, the meteor came, right? So, or while he's calling for the dog and the dog's not coming back, seeing him look over at a picture of his wife who's dead, we would get that right away, and having the dog come back just a little long, like he has to wait for it, and you can see him being like, oh shit, I can't lose another thing. And then the dog comes back and seeing him go, you know, you don't have to say anything. You could say all of that in 30 seconds, and then we care about him, and we get on board with his sort of life.
Or the drunk hosting the party, like as if him and Steve had a scene earlier in the movie, like maybe when he's buying the alcohol and he's like some super straight-laced guy you wouldn't expect to get wasted like that.
Yeah,
all
exactly.
Of a sudden at the party.
He could be the guy going into the liquor store, and some of the teenagers, which is American Graffiti does this, but there's a teenager that we meet later standing outside being like, hey man, can you buy me here's $3. Can you buy me a whatever? And he's like, how dare you? You know what I mean? He says, like, that's inappropriate. You should be ashamed of yourself. Like, you be careful, get out of here, or else I know who you are. I know where you live. We live in the same town. Like, I know your dad. I'll tell him what's going on. You want that? And the kid's like, sorry, man. Like, take it easy. Like, chill out. See you later. And then we see him later at the party wasted. Yes, that's the stuff.
That is American Graffiti, which for me it's
but that's why American Graffiti works.
But they're different in that sense for me in a way that's not bad. Like, because the filmmakers didn't care about those things, I just didn't care about those things for this one.
Right, but I guess what I'm saying is, for me, like, from a taste point of view, to really get me into a movie like this, I want stuff like that. Or I want, if you were going to throw it out and just go on a like, we're just running through the streets trying to get away from a thing.
Totally. Well, we'll always have Fiend Without a Face. Sorry. I think did all those things better for you.
I mean, dude, we watched that army dude run through the woods for like 5 minutes and back. And I'm into it. Like, it works for me because something's happening. He's like, he's got a goal, and he has to run and turn a thing on and blow a thing up and run back. Like, all of that, yeah, it's something.
It's funny because again, it was just the actors were enough for me to take care of these things that maybe objectively could have.
That's interesting, yeah.
Helped. Or I could say the non-actors, too, were enough in a sense, too. Right. You know what I mean? Like, all that did the lifting for me that, in an objective way, you could have maybe made the characters or script better. Just by the end, I was feeling that on the first watch, but by the end of it, like, everything had just won me over. Yeah. So, like, cool. I agree, I guess, but it just didn't matter in the end. Or then what it would have been was something different, and I wouldn't want to change it at this point.
Yeah. No, I dig. Well, all of the above.
We've been touching on some things of note. Are you ready for that? Or
yes, let's do
Great.
it.
Here we go. Things of note.
Things of note.
This should be interesting.
It's funny imagining Quentin Tarantino's Blob movie now, Tim, which would be so good. I was always trying to imagine, like, how do you remake the Blob, whatever.
Yeah.
And so, I guess this is things I know. I did watch the sequel. I think it was
really?
from 1972, which is known as Son of the Blob and Beware of the Blob.
Yeah,
it's
I've heard Beware of the Blob.
Larry Hagman, from Dallas. It's his one sole directing credit. It's got like, actually from American Graffiti, what's her face? The non-Laverne or the non-Penny Marshall Laverne and Shirley. Cindy Williams is in it.
Yeah.
She was great, but just a bit part. You even had Burgess Meredith pop up for a scene who we just saw.
Wow.
It was like the first 10 minutes, you just go like, oh God, this is bad. Like it's shot horribly and just feels weird and is not good. But then, you know what? By the end, I quick, after a kind of rocky start, I got pretty on board with it just because it was fun to see like if this was quintessential 1950s people, this was quintessential 1960s, like teens, hippies, police, or whatever.
Okay.
They're like smoking pot. There's like a weird party, or one of them's in a gorilla costume.
Oh, God.
It's just like, the cops accuse them of like, I don't know, and I don't care if you're on some sort of trip, but like that's the context of it. And more just super fun model stuff of like the big finales at a bowling alley that's connected to an ice rink. And so like the model shot where it's like kind of like this in the movie theater, you have the miniature, all the end of the lanes of the bowling alley, and like the blob getting shoved through that and coming out as if it's taking over the whole bowling alley. It was so good.
Cool.
So yeah, it was. I do not regret watching it. It was more blob action just set then. But anyway, back to what would Quentin Tarantino's remake be? I feel like even though my default approach to being a new Blob movie would be you want to set it in the modern era, kind of like what you do with New Invasion of the Body Snatchers. Always just let's have the fun. That is how you do the same story but make it fun again. But a Tarantino one, I think I would want to see it set in the 50s. Something about that. Yeah. That's the one approach where I wouldn't want to see that other approach of making it contemporary. Anyway, it's fun to imagine.
Yeah. Well, Pulp Fiction is basically a Blob movie, so.
Sure. You mean Inglourious Bastards.
Yes.
Actually, it not too far. Once Upon a Time in Hollywood is throwbacky to that.
Definitely.
Closer to that time, 1970 it took place, whatever. I really, really love Once Upon a Time in Hollywood. Anyway,
me too.
We're on the Blob, Tim. Did you have anything? Should I just ramble everything I found? What do you want to hear?
No, I don't really have anything. My dad, just to bring back my dad, anytime in any form or another, anything blobby comes up, my dad is always very quick to be like, oh, Steve McQueen, The Blob, what a great movie. He's like, the movie theater scene. It's the movie theater scene. Classic.
Well, I'm glad you could represent that he'd say that if we can't hear it directly from him.
Yeah.
That'd be fun to get some follow-up words from him. So yeah, I sort of mentioned, Steve McQueen had some indifference towards playing a teenager when he was 27. And then and that in itself also just as an acting challenge, as he put it, he kind of resented it where he's just like, oh, there's a monster. It's a monster. He kind of looked down at it for that while he was shooting it. He said when people said he was good in it, he wasn't totally thrilled about it. Maybe he wanted to give a better performance. he made only $3,000 on it because he preferred to get cash up front versus any profit participation. And the Blob, it grossed 30 times its original investment. So
yeah, it was $110,000 budget, I think, right? Yeah, and it made $4 million.
Which, what a good investment if he had taken it. And it was funny listening to the Jack Harris commentary where he really wanted to get it under budget. The budget was set at $100,000. Oh. And he felt so bad during the special effects production of the film when he had to go to some investors and say, oh, look, I don't think I can get it under. In fact, it's got to take 10,000 more. And the investors' response to that was, this movie's like already so cheap. Like, it's fine. Like,
right.
You're making $100,000 movie here. It's okay, Jack. So a bit on Jack Harris too. It's fun hearing about his story and who he is, where he went on to help make, Dark Star, the John Carpenter, Dan O'Bannon film, and Equinox, Dennis Muren. But his deal was sort of taking, in different stages, films that were being made independently or sort of by up-and-comers, first filmmakers, and harboring those into completion or distribution. So the Blob being the sort of big main first one that he did.
That's nice of him.
Yeah, about who he is. The filmmakers on this, I mentioned the director's name, Irvin S. Yeaworth Jr. Him and his crew were just kind of left of the filmmakers of, who are doing those industrial films who made Carnival of Souls. The Blob filmmakers and his crew were religious filmmakers.
What?
Which is pretty funny. Yeah, they were like, that was their deal where they had made tons of 16 millimeter, religious film productions and went on to do more stuff like that. But the Blob was their foray into not doing that.
Interesting.
Yeah. And so, let's see. So on, you're interested in kind of a little more tidbits on who Steve McQueen was and maybe little fun stories with him. It was really fun in Jack Harris's, the producer's commentary, him talk about his relationship with Steve McQueen, where he told this one story where Steve was on the phone and said, you got to get here, blah, blah, blah. Some problems going on. And, real quick before I forget, let me back up. The only thing I kind of remembered about it being a religious film that affected it was that they couldn't shoot on Sundays. So they had like 5 Sundays where Jack Harris wishes they could have been shooting, but they couldn't.
God.
So anyway, back to Jack Harris talking about Steve McQueen. He got the call one day. It sounded like there was just something going on where Steve was kind of calling in a tizzy and had to drive from some other obligation across state to show up and be like, all right, what's the problem, Steve? He shows up and Steve's just all casual. Oh, hey, Jack, how's it going? Well, what's going on? And apparently Steve had been like on the phone with his agent, his publicist, and had been like arguing with the director and all this stuff where the director didn't want Steve to see his, the dailies, to see his performance. Steve really wanted to, work off of and see the dailies to work off of that. So the attitude that he sort of described it felt like Steve McQueen saw, even though he wasn't that much older at all, was sort of like treating Jack Harris like he was the daddy, and he was telling on Dad that, they weren't letting him see the footage kind of thing. But Jack Harris was kind of like, listen, I'm not the director. If he doesn't want you to see the footage, then that's up to him kind of thing. And then it was okay after that. But he was apparently putting up quite the tantrum of like, I'm going to tell, or let's get Jack on board and see what he says kind of thing.
Wow.
It was funny. And then he just sort of tells the story of when he'd see him throughout over the course of the years. Steve McQueen didn't live till that long.
What did he die? He had cancer of some sort, right?
Yeah, I think at was he 40 or somewhere in that range?
Yeah. Let me look.
He
was
50.
Definitely young.
He died at 50.
Oh, yeah. 50! That's so young.
Yeah.
Jesus.
So it was funny. He told one of the first times he'd ran into him after not seeing him for years was at the supermarket in LA. Wish I knew which one it was. But they were checking out and Steve McQueen didn't see Jack Harris there. He was just a couple people behind him or whatever in line. And the woman checking him out, Steve McQueen, was like, don't I know you from somewhere? Or I recognize you, which I'm sure he gets all the time. And Steve McQueen was like, oh yeah, The Great Escape, and listening to some of his big films like that. And then Jack Harris from behind was like, how about the Blob, Steve? And Steve like turned and looked at him, probably chuckled like, hey, it's you. But then he was immediately just like, well, it's not a tell-all. That's what he said to him. Like, it's like hiding that past of the Blob or something.
That's funny.
And then he hadn't seen him again for like 8 or 9 years. And he said randomly, like, I don't know if he was out in Malibu or whatever, Jack Harris's house, somewhere by the beach. He sees Steve McQueen standing outside of his house. And after not having seen him for 9 years, he's like, what are you doing here, Steve? And Steve's like, well, I'm making a movie over here and I wanted to rent your house out for the month. And he's like, I don't think, that's not going to work. Whatever. That was kind of funny. And then Jack went to visit Steve when he died on what was essentially his deathbed, which was he was down in Mexico, just getting some kind of experimental treatment or just, pick that place to kind of go out or whatever. He was in some, not Adobe, but, this Mexican house. And after, so it was kind of neat where like after these recurring sort of stories about Steve McQueen. Oh no, here's the ending. The other fun thing that happened when he was standing outside of his house in Malibu. He said something like Steve's agent or something was like there too. And what exactly did he say? Where he had said something about like, oh yeah, Jack was my producer on the Blob, and kind of downplayed it or something, like it was just some little thing. And Jack was like, now hang on, Steve, would you be standing here in front of my house today if it wasn't for the Blob? And Steve was kind of like, no, I guess you're right. Did get him to reassess the importance it played in his life. So anyway, now back to Mexico. Steve's dying, and he sees that hanging on Steve's wall right next to his bed is indeed a poster for the Blob.
Oh, wow. Well, It was his first leading role, so, big deal.
I think and he seems like he saw that in the end, kind of came full circle, hopefully appreciated the fandom for it in the end. Yeah. That was a fun ending to the sort of their relationship, their story, his story with the Blob. Jack Harris was literally inspired by another film we just covered, The Thing from Another World. He said he saw The Thing as an intended audience member and had reacted accordingly, had a ball, thought it was great, and thought, yeah, I should make a sci-fi monster movie.
Nice. Well, he did.
And then a little bit that I caught with the commentary with the director, he told the anecdote where it was great sort of how it all came together, but they randomly saw Steve McQueen in Central Park. They had met him before, him and the producer Jack. They saw him in Central Park, and sort of there and then they had met each other a long time ago, the two of them and Steve McQueen. But then and there they struck a deal for the Blob just after running into him sort of about at the right time. It's funny.
But
wild. It was just one of those little anecdotes that made it seem like it was all, one of those films that had serendipity on its side, as we've seen many of the classics do.
Yeah. Cool.
And then I already mentioned, last thing I had was there is indeed a Blob Fest in in Pennsylvania, where the theater was shot in Phoenixville, I think is the town. And it started in 2000. And this year they're doing their first virtual Blob Fest due to coronavirus pandemic. But hey, it's still going. You can see the Blob itself. It's great. I watched, James Rolfe's Cinemassacre's little overview on it. It's so great. They recreate the running out of the theater. We have just as many people reenacting as you do onlookers. And then after everyone runs out, they had a couple people dressed as firefighters, with extinguishers. And then you have the owner of the Blob, he comes out with this bucket that says the Blob on it and holds it up, and everyone's cheering for the Blob.
Oh my God.
Which it's made out of silicone silicone and food dye, just red food coloring.
Okay.
So he's been told that silicone, unlike, a lot of the costumes for all the other old classic monsters, which have all rotted away, that this thing will outlive us all. Silicone blob.
That's crazy. Wow.
So there's some fun blob facts for you too. And then there's the sequel I saw. There's the 80s remake. Rob Zombie
I'd really
was
like to
apparently
watch
going to make it.
The 80s one.
Yeah, me too. Well, I think we'll get to it on the show eventually. I think that sounds right.
Yep.
Great. Any other questions or comments for things of note, Tim?
I just like that you had mentioned the opening song written by Burt Bacharach and Mac David.
Yeah.
It became a hit. It was on the Billboard chart.
So my favorite part about it is it's credited to the band The Five Blobs.
Yeah.
So it's called The Blob by The Five Blobs, but really it's one guy overdubbing all the parts. So it's funny.
Oh my God, that's so funny. It's such a funny song.
And it's on Spotify, everyone. So rock out, knock yourself out.
That's all. That's really all I got. It's so amazing. It made a ton of money.
Yeah.
Happened right at the perfect time.
Mm-hmm. Big hit.
Yeah.
It's the Blob.
Cool,
Again, high concept.
Yeah.
Great. Well, thank you, the Blob. We'll put a bow on you and wrap up our episode as we do with if we have any recommendations. Tim, because I can segue, I'm going to jump in and go ahead. But I was holding my tongue when you said the beginning reminded you of the early James Bond movies. Because something about the end of the year leading up to New Year's and New Year's Eve, I just got on this James Bond kick. And I watched Goldfinger, Thunderball, You Only Live Twice. I watched those, those Sean Connery ones in succession. Mm-hmm. They're all chronological. They were so good. I've never appreciated them as much as I did, I don't know, since ever I last watched them. Yeah. But I get more than ever why Sean Connery is people's favorite. And the music, the whole 60s, 70s, 60s for those aesthetic were just so good. I loved it so much, and it's made me excited to I'm kind of hopping around the whole James Bond series now. But I could just recommend those three, and I kind of do. But I'll say start with Goldfinger is where I started, and then if you enjoy that, just keep it going with Thunderball, You Only Live Twice. But yeah, Goldfinger, God, and that theme that it starts with, I just love it so much, Tim, and I'm sure you do too.
Oh, definitely. I mean, personally, I think my favorite is From Russia with Love.
Yeah.
But, okay, so that means I have to recommend Dead something? God, boy, I don't know. Man, what have I been doing? I rewatched all of the Star Wars movies in a particular order. So I'm going to recommend Dead this order. So get a pen out. Here we go. Ready? Start with Episode 4, A New Hope. Then go to Rogue One, so you can see how they got the Death Star plans. Then go to Empire Strikes Back. Then, since you've just found out that Vader is Luke's father, oh, sorry, spoiler alert, go back to the prequels, Episode 1, 2, and 3. Having said that, they are awful, the prequels. Really hard to watch. So many problems.
The first one will always hold a special place in my heart. That's my favorite out of them.
No joke. I think that in watching them, I was like, they're so close to having everything you need to make it amazing, and they just missed on for a couple reasons. And you could go down an infinite rabbit hole of reasons why.
Topher Grace did a fan edit of them.
Oh,
and
nice.
Apparently,
I would. We were thinking about that when I was watching. When I was talking about what you would cut and how you could make one movie out of those three movies. You could do it.
It's not available, but that's why you need to be friends with him. So But other people have made fan edits from the prequels anyways. I'll always defend the first one. I know it's largely to do because I was the perfect age when I saw it.
Yeah.
But there's something, it's the shot on filmness. It doesn't feel like a big Blueby CG mess in the way that 2 and 3 do.
Mm-hmm.
And I think the pod racing scene's awesome, and the Darth Maul and the fight with him is awesome.
Totally.
And Qui-Gon and Obi-Wan, even though they're kind of wet blankety throughout, they're still kind of fun at the same time.
So after you do 1, 2, and 3, I suggest you do Solo, because it actually would happen chronologically next. And then you jump to the most recent trilogy, the last 3. What is that? 7, 8, and 9, right? Yeah. And that's it. That's my order.
I did them all leading up to the release of 9, but in like chronological story order, like starting with 1. So why not Rogue One before New Hope?
Because I think that it's important if you're gonna watch this. Like, this is the sort of the bulk of it. Obviously, is the Skywalker sort of saga. So I think it just makes sense to start and end with the establishment of the world through Luke's eyes and end with it through Rey's eyes. Like, that makes that, just from a broad arc storytelling point of view, I think that makes the most sense. Because, Rogue One is just a side movie. It's not really linked into the greater story, but it is a fun little side story. So, yeah.
I will say one thing,
because I think it would be weird. It would be weird to if you came in completely blind, had never watched any Star Wars, and you start with Rogue One. I don't think it would make sense. You'd be like, who's who and why and what? And like when Vader and Leia show up at the end, you'd be like, you wouldn't care. The impact of that would mean nothing.
So, but you have seen it. So is the order you watched it in kind of like what you'd want to show to kids if you had them? Like,
yeah. Okay. I mean, honestly, my niece and nephew right now are doing all of them in order of like release date. And they got to, they haven't seen Revenge of the Sith. And my brother and his wife were like, is this okay for them? Like, they're pretty young. And I was like, it's not. Like, they're like, my niece and nephew are, they're sensitive, right? Like, they're not like into violence or like pain or, trauma. And I don't think they could watch it. It's so intense at the end.
Yeah,
it's
when
also
he's getting his face burned off. Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, dude. So, yeah. I think go watch The Battle for Endor or something like that.
Right, there's 2 Ewok movies.
Yeah, Caravan of Courage and The Battle for Endor.
There's all these like Lego holiday specials and things like that.
Oh my God. We tried watching the holiday special, like it's on YouTube. Woof. It is
Life Day, yeah.
Unacceptable.
Well,
anyway, so there you go. That's my recommendation, that order.
So Tim also has his Marvel movie order recommendation that
that's right.
You can scroll down on our Instagram and see. So now the Star Wars one too. Great. Well, I mean, hey, I could go on endlessly about Star Wars, but we're not here for that.
I was really inspired by like conceptualizing because of like how we do on this show often, talking about what would you do to make it different or better. And man, I love Star Wars, and I can see really amazing movies in the prequels that just didn't achieve that. But like, I can in my brain conceive of what I think would be just so great. And my friend was like, "Do you think they'll ever remake these movies?" And I don't know. I almost think in like 50 years they might.
Yeah, I've always thought about that. It's interesting though how they're working them into canon in a way.
Yeah.
Like,
yeah.
I feel more more mixed feelings, let down about the sequel trilogy than the prequel trilogy at this point, because they seem the prequel trilogy I can kind of detach from the originals, but just as far as living through the sequel trilogy, just as far as feeling more like a missed opportunity. I mean, it all is, but maybe it's just because it's more recent and I'm not as much of a kid, but we still have the kid in us, which is why we're still talking about it.
Agreed.
We care.
Yep. All right. Well, so enough with that. I'm going to pull from the hat. Are you ready?
Yes.
This one. Whoa, it's a long one. Here we go. It says, The Endless. It's from 2018. It was submitted by Jesse Brownstein. And then there's a quote, these guys were written about, and then that's all it says. I don't know what they were written about. But I know these guys.
You didn't print it all out?
I guess not.
It says, these guys were written about as a new voice of horror, and I don't understand, and I don't really understand why. So something to that effect, Jesse was wondering.
Yeah, I've watched 3 or 4 of their movies.
Their movies?
Well, I've recommended one of them. Spring, I recommended it at one point. Yeah, I mean, Benson and Moorhead are the directors. I think that their movies are really interesting. So,
got it.
We'll talk about it.
Cool. Great. That's exactly what he wants to hear, is us talk about it.
Yeah.
See, figure out why. Do we agree? Do we disagree? Great. Well, until next week for The Endless, you can find us wherever you found us. We got an Instagram, we got a Twitter, we got a website, URL, dismemberinghorror.com. You can comment, send us messages, all those places. Submit a movie yourself you'd like us to dismember. We'd love that.
Yeah. Do it.
Great. Well, in closing, do beware the blob, and thanks for listening.
That's right, and we will see you next week. Good blob.